that accommodation piece, on a fundamental level, educators in Ontario are supported by human rights policy, specifically the Ontario Human Rights Code, which names specifically gender identity and gender expression as grounds for accommodation. So in this toolkit, we have a section devoted to policy and legislation, where we excavate some of the key policies, legislation that are in place. We look at what some boards are doing across the province that you can click on and look at. We give a detailed account of different PPMs that are in place that were put in place with the intention of supporting human rights and in some cases specifically gender. Beyond the provincial piece, provincial legislation piece, the Ontario Ministry of Education and also board level policy has embedded the expectations that educators are expected to accommodate trans and gender diverse youth. In many of these cases, as emerged in our report, educators would often signal, and this is tied to the accommodation piece, we don't have any visibly trans kids, and therefore they'd forego doing any proactive work to foster an affirming school. It's usually very reactive or waiting until a student is either introduced, assumptions are made about a student, or a student has to specifically out themselves for support that a trans inclusive policy is picked up and effectuated or an attempt is made. So much like the previous module, this one helps crystallize that you can't rely on the visible trans student to appear before doing the work. It's work that impacts the entire community. It's work that is first and foremost enshrined in legislation and policy at every level, but it's also work that can't simply stay at accommodation. That gets back to the inclusive piece and not the affirming piece, because that in effect doesn't confront or acknowledge the systems of harm that continue to put trans and gender diverse students at risk. And in actuality, to rely on this logic of accommodation results in the individual trans student having to advocate for themselves, which puts them at elevated risk, often outing themselves to seek out this accommodation, sometimes having to skirt around their parents, not knowing their identity and having to navigate that system on their own. And again, it leaves the system that puts them at risk completely intact in order to make them fit into a cis-normative system. And so here we excavate some of the policy and legislation that outline the expectations, but also the systemic responsibilities and how having this policy and legislation is important, but it's not necessarily enough to create that affirming school.
And so finally, what we have is our